As we think about going home, that may mean different things to different people, but we can visualize it in our mind's eye, depending on where we are in this season of life. Going home from the hospital means something very different than going home from your dream vacation, right? Going home after a long day at work means something very different than going home from the cemetery. Going home for a visit is very different than going home because we have nowhere else to go. Home. If you've grown up in church, chances are you have heard of Ruth, and I dare say that most of us see her as loving and compassionate. We see her as dedicated, a faithful daughter-in-law. Her statement to her mother-in-law, Naomi, has been used, ironically, in weddings all through time. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Home. But, like most life stories, Ruth's runs much deeper. Have you ever dared to think of Ruth as a traitor, as an outsider? Do you see Ruth as an enemy of God? Do you see Ruth as someone who does not belong? We're going to walk a little bit through Ruth's story. Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. During the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man with his wife and 2 sons went from Bethlehem of Judah to dwell in the territory of Moab. The name of that man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of her 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the territory of Moab and settled there. That sounds simple enough, right? There's a famine, so Elimelech takes his family to a more prosperous place. And we don't really know a lot about this family except that they are Ephrathites from the tribe of Judah. And ironically, these people represent prosperity and abundance. So they head to Moab. Simple enough. Except it's not so simple. You think Nick Saban leaving LSU and heading to Alabama was a bad thing? Imagine. Moab was one of the most controversial places they could have gone. Moab was a hated enemy of Judah. But yet that is where Elimelech takes his family. Verse 3, but Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And some might say he got what he deserved. He should never have done such a horrible thing. Then only she, Naomi, was left along with her 2 sons. They took wives for themselves, Moabite women. The name of the first was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth. Can we truly grasp what has happened? You see, not only have they settled in enemy territory, now they've married Moabite women, the lowest of the low. And they lived there for about 10 years, verse 5. But both of the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. Now, any respectable Hebrew reading this would not be surprised, right? They also had it coming for doing such a horrible thing. But the story continues. Only the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. In reading that this week, I found it very interesting that the writer does not call her or her children or her husband by name. Verse 6. Then she arose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field of Moab, because while they were in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. Verse 7. She left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her. They went with her along the road to return to the land of Judah. So this woman, whose family has commingled with the enemy, when things were so bad, she's now heading home, now when things are good. And she, by the way, has nothing left. Now that either takes a lot of nerve or a lot of desperation. And at this point, as we see in the next verse, the writer calls her by name again, maybe to make sure that she owns who she is and what she has done. Verse 8. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back, each of you, to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you, just as you have done with the dead and with me." Verse 9. May the Lord provide for you so that you may find security, each one in the household of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. You see, during this time, as most of you know, women had no value outside of a husband or a son. And Naomi recognizes this for her 2 daughters-in-law. And maybe she wants more for them. But they replied in verse 10, "No, instead we will return with you to your people." Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there again be sons in my womb that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters. Go. I am too old for a husband. If I were to say that I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you refrain from having a husband? No, my daughters. This is more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me." Can you hear the desperation in Naomi's voice? It's as though she's carrying this guilt of desertion for the entire family. "Even the Lord is against me," she says. Or at least that's what she thinks. Some scholars conclude that there is no way to justify this family's move from Bethlehem to Moab. Some say it's unforgivable what they have done. And maybe Naomi is feeling the weight of that after all these years. Maybe she is carrying her husband's shame. And do these foreign daughter-in-laws, do they need to be shielded from that shame, or do they add to it? Verse 14, then they, the daughters-in-law, lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Verse 15, Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law." We don't really hear from Orpah again, but remember, she is not doing anything unethical or unfaithful. She is the one who is obediently following what Naomi tells her to do. And is it that she doesn't love Naomi enough? Or does she love her too much? I don't want to be a burden for you. I don't want to disrespect your authority. I don't want to be a hardship. Verse 16, but Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following you. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so, if even death separates you from me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking about it. You see, Naomi does return home to Bethlehem, basically empty-handed, except for this daughter-in-law, who, by the way, is poor, a widow, childless, not to mention a pagan, an outsider, an enemy, a result of desertion. Now, is that really what Naomi needs tagging along? Just think, if this story of Ruth had been planted in the story of Ezra or the time of Nehemiah, both Naomi and Ruth would have been executed. Naomi as a traitor, and Ruth for no other reason than the color of her skin and her bloodline. This story, which is only 4 short chapters, has so many twists and turns and even a few controversial schemes, but it boils down to a young woman who does not belong. Think about it. Ruth, a Moabite of all people, marries the enemy and continues to live in Moab. What does that say about her community? Surely she was cut off from her people as well. Maybe she didn't go home because her family refused to take her back. We don't know the full backstory, but we know she certainly does not belong in Bethlehem. The law is certain about that. But yet she says, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Maybe she knew that death comes to traitors and foreigners. You know, last week we were invited to drop our rocks of judgment. And this week, maybe we're invited to consider to stand before those, or what it's like to stand before those who are ready to throw rocks in our direction. Naomi and Ruth are literally walking into the line of rock throwing. Naomi because of her desertion, and Ruth because of where she comes from. Can you imagine how shocking Ruth's story must have been to those who are hearing it for the first time? You see, Ruth ends up marrying Boaz, who, by the way, is one of the wealthiest, most respected men in Bethlehem, who also just happens to be a relative of Naomi's late husband. Ruth has a son named Obed. Ruth becomes the grandmother of Jesse. Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David. Oh, not just any David. Psalm 23 David. King David. And who is from the lineage of David? Jesus the Christ. This same Jesus who almost 1,000 years later said, "Those of you without sin, cast the first stone." This same Jesus who said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you have done it unto me." And so as we reflect on this story of Ruth and Naomi, we're reminded of this deep human desire to belong, to be accepted. Ruth's journey from being an outsider to a cherished member of the community in Bethlehem is a powerful testament to the transformative power of love, loyalty, and God's grace. To someone who said, "No matter what, you are welcomed here." And so maybe that's our challenge this morning. Just as Ruth and Naomi found their place through unwavering commitment to one another and to their faith, let us continue, church, to be that true reflection of Christ's love, where everyone finds a home and knows that they can come home, that we are here. It's a part of our history. It's a part of our DNA. It is who we are as the body of Christ. And may we always remember that in God's home there are many rooms. And Jesus teaches that we are each welcomed. So may we carry that message of hospitality, that message of belonging into our hearts and minds this morning. Let us not give up on one another. Let us not give up on ourselves, because we each, like Ruth, hold a deeper story with so many life experiences, and yet each of us, through the love, mercy, and grace of Jesus Christ, we belong. You belong. You belong. You belong. Hear that this morning in the love, mercy, and grace of Jesus Christ. We belong.